Thank you for the invitation. Well, I wanted more to focus on the wider, I guess, security architecture that has taken us down this path towards this very destructive wars, genocide, now possibly direct war with Russia now, and also why I'm a bit optimistic about Trump's ability to steer it in a different direction. Now, from my perspective, a lot of this, the problems we have today, is the result of this post-Cold War aspiration of pursuing liberal hegemony. That is, international system of based on Western dominance for I guess you can call it a benign purpose to elevate the role of liberal democratic values. Now, I argue this simply failed because much like other forms of idealism, it tends to neglect power relations. So I've actually found a quote by Raymond Aron, a French philosopher most are probably familiar with, who he wrote then back in the 60s. A quote here that idealistic diplomacy slips too often into fanaticism. It divides states into good and evil, and peace-loving and bellicose. It envisions a permanent peace by the punishment of the latter and the triumph of the former. The idealist, believing he has broken with power politics, exaggerates its crimes. End quote. Now, I argue that the main argument for unipolarity, what we're really striving effectively now to preserve, be it in the Middle East or in Ukraine, simply refers to one center of power, as I said, one can argue for the benign purpose of elevating liberal democratic values. So if all states are equally represented, then the logic is that there's less role for liberal democratic values. And this is effectively why in the 90s many argued for international aristocracy, in which the few enlightened would rule for the benefit of all. And this is why we eventually rejected an inclusive European security architecture as well, one that would be based on indivisible security aimed at mitigating security competition. Instead, the objective was to transcend power competition altogether with liberal hegemony. So instead, we went for what I've labeled interdemocratic security institutions, which is NATO, EU, essentially a club of democracies who, again, more enlightened than the rest and will rule the world. Again, this is a return to bloc politics, but the logic is this is a force for good. Now, my point is that liberal hegemony was premised on this notion that hegemony was required to advance these liberal democratic values. However, we all see that hegemony requires an extreme concentration of power. It requires very aggressive tools. And instead of creating a world where liberal democratic values are elevated above power politics, we see that liberal democratic values are effectively corrupted as they become instead instruments to legitimize power politics. And I think that's what we've seen over the past 30 years. So again, when we attempted to pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit in 2014 against the will of the vast majority of Ukrainians, I think this is an example of what we did. Now we can also see in the last few weeks only what has been done effectively in the name of advancing liberal democracy. We effectively walked away from a lot of this key mission, as opposed to what we envisioned liberal hegemony would look like in the 90s. Now we are supporting a genocide in Palestine, become complicit, and criticizing the genocide for some reason is now controversial. We just assisted in toppling Assad in Syria, which makes us effectively partners with HTS, and we're working very hard to whitewash Al Qaeda. We effectively backed rigging the elections in Moldova. We tried to topple the democratically elected government in Georgia because they voted the wrong way, so we wanted to reverse the election results. In Romania, the election results were actually reversed as they were cancelled, given that they also voted for a candidate who wanted to end the war in Ukraine and restore diplomacy with the Russians. We see now those calling for effectively continued war with Russia. which could be, if we have a nuclear war, would be an immense genocide. People warning against this, that we should respect the nuclear deterrent, argue now that there is no nuclear deterrent, there's only nuclear blackmail. If we fear Russian nuclear weapons, that they will retaliate with them, that means we're buying into blackmail, and we should not be allow ourselves to be frightened by nuclear weapons. Of course, this is an absurd notion. If it was the other way around, if the Chinese or Russians had toppled the government in Mexico and then set up there and began to arm the government to launch missiles into the United States, and the US threatened with nuclear weapons, no one would have said that we should not legitimize this by giving into its blackmail. It's, again, we have really gone off the deep end, and we can also not discuss Russian or Chinese security concerns anymore. As some might have noticed in the media, this is usually how you would mitigate security concerns among the great powers. Now we believe that the world is socially constructed, and if we recognize that adversaries have security concerns, we legitimize it. So instead, we only attribute evil motivations to our adversaries. So again, it begs the question, what is the plan now forward? What is the strategic objective? Because in the 90s, all power concentrated in the West. This is when we went for liberal hegemony. The GDP, the technology, transportation corridors, financial power, all focused on concentrated in the West. And the main foreign policy of both Russia and China was to get as close as possible with the West. So if we couldn't establish a perpetual peace then, it's reasonable to doubt it can be done now. So both Russia and China, it's worth noting, since the 90s, before and after, considered that containment never ended. And why? Well, this is the premise of hegemony. You can't allow other centers of power from emerging. But again, now we see BRICS is larger than the G7, and also predictably, under hegemony in the West, we have exhausted material resources, thrown away a lot of the soft power as well as credibility to act as the world's policeman. And also we incentivized other great powers, again, as we see in BRICS, to construct parallel economic infrastructure to balance the West. So it's simply, time to adjust to multipolarity. Whether or not multipolarity is good or bad, it's kind of besides the point. This is just the reality now. And but we're not discussing this. We're talking about knocking out Russia from the ranks of great power, and that even that won't create perpetual peace. This is when we can instead focus all our resources on knocking out China. And of course, at some point, we also have to destroy Iran. So this, no one has really outlined how we're going to restore this liberal hegemony. So just to finish off, I just say that in the past 30 years, if we believe that the forever wars against weak states were a disaster, then we can only assume, fear the worst, what this would result if we're going to start defeating other great powers. So my urge is to revisit some of the decisions and the arguments of the 90s. Again, did the liberal hegemony elevate our values above power politics, or have we begun even to throw away these values at home? So I think it's the failure to adjust to these new realities. I think it's resulted, of course, in society becoming much uglier, less free, become more crude, dishonest, ignorant, and aggressive. Again, our economies have exhausted themselves. People are exhausted. We see moral decline, no sense of common humanity. Diplomats, especially in Europe, who do not believe in diplomacy anymore, who state it quite openly. We have political leaders who suffer a crisis in competency and honesty. We have governments across Europe now who appears to be falling left and right. Yet political leaders, they don't seem to be willing to reverse anything at all. And all we're talking about is to defeat our adversaries. So when I see Trump speaking now, I know we're all told we should be horrified, and I have a few complaints about the man myself. But the fact that he comes out and say that, perhaps we shouldn't have expanded NATO up to Russia's border into Ukraine, this was always understood, and suggesting this is what triggered the war. For me, this is the first step to peace. When great powers recognize their mutual security concerns and begin to accommodate them, this is when, yeah, we can take a step towards peace. Alternatively, the only way of pursuing peace is to defeat the adversary. So, me for one, despite all his flaws, I'll even give him Greenland. Just as long as he can end this war, he has my vote. So, thank you.